But this is Eugene Smith, you're right, and then that's me. This is when we were photographing Minamata. It was taken by a Minamata victim, and it was very close to our house. And I can tell you a little bit about how I met Gene and how I learned about photography. And I want to share a little bit about how he taught photography. That's our car right there. And this is where we lived for 3 years when we photographed. And the guy up there is just because Gene thought it was interesting, the picture. Otherwise, we never took a picture of our house. And so this is in front of the house, me and our landlady. And that's our messy room. We just had one room. And this is where we worked. There's a big age difference, 30 years, but I felt like I was older and he was sort of younger. It was like dealing with a, I don't know, really young person. It was tiring, actually. So this is the same room, cleaned up a little bit more. And the family altar was there. The family, our landlords had lost a daughter to Minamata disease, and that's her photograph right there. And my futon was right where Jean is sitting there. So I lived with her for like 3 years. She would have been a little bit older had she lived, but she fell ill at age 5 and suffered tremendously and died at age 8. And here I was, at 21 and, photographing and trying to, do things and excited about it. And so, it's such a discrepancy. This is again, very messy, but this is the mud dirt floor, which was our kitchen and initially where we did the photographic work. So we developed the film here. You can do it out, you don't have to have dark room. Spell film, and actually the photograph Tomoko in the back, we developed the negative here, and we hung it up on those clothespins up there, and we had to clear up the negatives and have them completely dry before the bath water, which is back there. That's our bath, and we used kindling to make the water hot. So we had to make sure we timed it so the ashes wouldn't get on the negatives. This is then we got a darkroom, another one for 2,000 yen, which is about like $15 a month, which was expensive for us because we didn't have any kind of finance during the 3 years. So I was 21 to 24 when I was living here. This is Jean, who's very playful. And at that time, they really welcomed us, but of course it was very challenging to photograph victims. And that's their family here. That's Jean there. And they really welcomed outside people because they felt like Tomoko's mother said, unless people see it, they can't understand the hardship. So they wanted to make it really visible. We took the Minamata director to Minamata, and when he met Namai Salam here, he inserted that character into the movie. And they were in the middle of a lawsuit, and this is when they won in 1973. And I was 23 years old, or 22, right? And that's the verdict translated in English, which you want to get. Well, just to give you a short story, when I went to the loft, Gene's loft, he was preparing this retrospective exhibition. It was 600 prints of all the work he had done up to that, the Pacific War, he photographed 13 invasions, and then Life magazine essays in the 1950s. And then he hadn't really been photographing that much later since he photographed Pittsburgh in 58. Well, he published in 58. So I met him in 1970. And when I walked in, I didn't even know that a 600 print show was a large show. Really. And it was sort of really delayed. And so I decided to drop out of college. Well, I ended up dropping out of college and helping him prepare it. So at the beginning, it was not, but the loft was, everybody had cameras. It was like camera was a part of your arm, kind of like we were just taking photographs along the way, daily life, kind of. So it just started that way. And then the first year was basically darkroom work. It's just that you're just immersed in the situation and trying to get those prints made and the exhibition deadline. And so just work at it. I don't know. And so he was, printing, and I was with him helping. And so after like about 7 prints of one print that he couldn't get it right, I kind of had it memorized, because of the way he dodges and the way he's, the dodging and the burning it. So I just did exactly what he was doing, but with that one additional missing point that he wanted to have. And so it's not like I'm not very artistic. I didn't have any background, but the first print I ever made ended up in the exhibition. And it's just because I was just following what he was doing. That's how it started. And then when we went to Minamata, it was more the challenge of getting the story out. So all I thought about is how to work with him and be able to tell the story. So he's photographing there and trying to tell the story. I never felt a hardship, I think. I mean, there were lots of all-nighters and, all that stuff was really hard. But yeah, there were like 3 all-nighters or 2 all-nighters a week. That's kind of the way it worked.
Great. Maybe you could tell us a little bit more about learning photography and what point it was that you felt like you had confidence in yourself as a photographer.
Yeah, again, I never was challenged in saying, do I have confidence? Would I have competence as a photographer? It was more, the first thing was trying to get that exhibition done. So, it was just about working to make it happen. And I knew that I had to carry a big load also to make it on time. So I was just doing it. I know it sounds like, kind of like I'm not explaining it, but that's exactly the way it was. Yeah, I was in the moment. So I think that the lesson I learned from how you teach and how you learn is that finally the order doesn't matter. It's not like, okay, you're a novice, so you should just do this, and then we'll get to the next level, and then we'll get to the next level. But it's more like what has to be done then, and you do that. And then so like I didn't even develop film or make proof prints and contact prints until like, I don't know, 3 weeks later, when I started, when we were printing, because right at the beginning it was just printing for the exhibition. And then there were rolls of film because we keep photographing just around, it was just normal that every couple weeks develop film. So that's when I first developed film. And then when there's a little time preparing the exhibition, you make proof prints or something. And the other thing we had to do is, because there was no even copy machines, we had to make all the prints to size when we laid it out. It was really quite complicated because you had to make, you couldn't just get an image and make it smaller and lay it out or put it on screen because there were no computers around. So then I learned how to do that.
So do you think that your relationship to photography sort of changed as your activism was involved? Did you think of it more as a sort of a craft as you went along, or did you think of it as a means to the goal of expressing the word about it?
Well, it was always a craft, from the beginning. And like I was just describing it darkly now, but when we went to Minamata, then it was about photographing. And there were the 2 of us, and we did it, the movie kind of tells it differently, but we did it jointly. But I think it was an interesting project because it's a veteran photographer. And then I had been taking pictures in the loft and everything like that, but working on her first project. But it was like a team that was pretty seamless. And so you kind of know telepathy-wise, kind of like I knew how he photographs, and then I'm in the same place, and I'm photographing, and we don't get in our way, but we're photographing, and you kind of know that the other, well, especially I knew kind of what Jean got, even before you see the negatives. And then I'm photographing the way I see it. And I think it's like you're seeing what's happening and you have to record it, and you're just trying to figure out how to do it, so that the message gets out the best. Mm-hmm. I think that the important part was at the beginning, initially, it wasn't the technical. It was more Gene pouring his heart out when we were laying out the exhibition, the 600 print show. Like, for example, his life essays like Schweitzer, he photographed Schweitzer in Africa. So there were like 100 images or more, and he laying it out. And as we're laying it out, you know, there's always like opera and La Boheme, and, you know, it's like, he's very emotional, and he's pouring his heart out about why he wants to make this final statement that he had never been able to make in Life magazine. And this was the moment to do it. And so he was very passionate about that, and also pouring his heart out about photojournalism and the integrity. He used the word integrity a lot, and his beliefs in photojournalism. And he said that there's no such thing as objectivity, because we're all subjective. We all have our own backgrounds and our own, the way we grew up and what we believe in and whatever. So everybody's subjective. So basically what he was saying is you're kind of lying when you say you're objective, you know, because you're not. But what's really important as a journalist, well, a photojournalist too, but is to be as honest and fair as possible. So he always talked about honesty and fairness. And then he also talked about the responsibility of a photojournalist, of a photographer, and it's the journalist, actually. And that's to your subjects and to the viewer. And if you meet those two responsibilities, you're meeting your responsibility as a photojournalist. And so that's really interesting, because when he worked for Life magazine, I mean, when I knew him, he just freelanced, right? There was nobody paid for this. Nobody was asking us to do it. We didn't have deadlines when we were in Minamata. But when he did have that, it was really constricted, you know, because it's Life magazine. You go out and get the story, you kind of got to come back. And he was always struggling and fighting with his editors. You know, like, I don't have the story yet. And they're telegramming him, you got to get back. And he says, no, I don't have it yet. And so he fought with the editors, but it's not because he wanted just his way, but because he knew he had to meet those two responsibilities. Unless he did that, he did not relent. You know, so he was known as a very stubborn person, and every photo essay that you see in Life magazine, it was just a result of a long fight, you know, of him trying to say, this is what I saw, and this is what has to be conveyed to the viewers. But he took pride in the fact that the end result, it did sell magazines. You know, it was powerful because it did resonate with the viewers. And so finally, he did service the magazine, you know, and it sold copies. But every time it sold copies, but the next essay, he would have this big fight with the editors again. So it was a repeat of that. Yeah. So I think hearing all of that, you become really passionate about photography and commitments. And, you know, so it was a lot about, you know, injustice and people being able to see it. And the title of his exhibition was called Let Truth Be the Prejudice. Let truth be the prejudice, which sounds really difficult, but it was more like we all have our prejudices, but the journalism's responsibility is to go and see what's happening and to the best of your ability, depict it as you see it as best as possible, and deliver it to the viewer. And so that the hope is that in our world, our prejudices, meaning prejudgment, is as close to reality as possible. And so that's the meaning of the title of his exhibition. So you just feel passionate about that and you want to do it. And that I think that's sort of my basic lesson in photography.
How about the other photographers who were working in Minamata at the time, like Kuwabara, you say, had been doing photographs before. So were you and in contact with these other photographers, or was it sort of a separate venture? Or
we were very much in contact with the other photographers who were photographing at that time, because we were all in the same place, and you know, in a way, almost like, and not helping each other, but you know, working in the same place. But and right now, what's happened in these 50 years is the first photographer that photographed was in 1960. This is Kuwabara Shise. He went in there, and at that time, none of the patients wanted any images out in the world. They did not want it. They just sort of say, get out. And so he was kind of forceful, but it was like, get out. And so he had a very different experience. And then after that, Shiota Takeshi, the other photographer, everybody's freelance. Nobody's working for anybody. He learned about this in a small article when he was in college in Tokyo, and he decided to travel to Minamata. He was only able to get one photograph in his first trip, and he just felt like the whole thing was a failure. But he felt he needed to go back again. And when we arrived, he had already started living there. And so we were very, in Japanese, it's called megumareteru, meaning when we arrived, the guy that told us about Minamata, that had told us about that in New York, he had discussed it with Shiota-san to meet us at the Minamata station. And it was like Shiota-san got the photograph, Eugene Smith photographing Minamata into a magazine. So it was like an assignment he had. And through that, he took us to all these different places. Like, here's the place where the effluent, wastewater is being, the pipe is the water is being dumped. Here's the view of the bay. Here's me introducing us to patients. So we had that kind of relationship. But I remember Shiota-san got his car for 5,000 yen, and I think we paid 8,000 yen for it. And I meant there were months that I wake up in the middle of the night saying, I'm sure we could have gotten one for $35 instead of paying $50 for our car. And it was like, what did I do? It was pretty difficult.
Right.
And we just spent the bulk, 80% of our money was on film and paper and his Suntory Red whiskey. And which was a bottle a day, because he was always had alcohol in him, because from World War II injuries, it hurt. And when you couldn't use the morphine anymore, he basically was dousing himself with alcohol the whole time. So those three were our major expenses. And I remember just getting down to 700 yen, about $4. And he bought a beer and I was mad, so that was what life was like.
And I think in some ways, I'm sure, I think I've heard you say before that since Eugene was a foreigner, there was some both benefits and drawbacks to that as well. So
yeah.
Maybe that's why you didn't get the deal on the car, but also maybe why people were a little bit more open at that time to speaking with a foreigner or.
Yeah, I think in many ways, people think that it was a greater challenge because he was completely, non-Japanese, and my mother's Japanese, my father's American. But arriving in Minamata, first of all, you don't understand the dialect. I mean, it was like, by the end of the third year, I was translating for journalists that were coming from Tokyo because they didn't understand what everybody was saying. So it was a challenge, but I think they saw us. It was so visible. Our house, you could see the inside of that one room, from the road, because the road was right there, and here's our house, And so we were very visible. Everybody knew that I put out the futon and it rained. It's like, oh my gosh, what are they doing? So, so it was a complex thing of being a journalist. So we never were at the strategy meetings. We were journalists, and yet we were very close to the victims, and we went to the lawsuit with them and on the bus together, and actually slept all in one room. Like 50 people would be all sleeping in one room with futons, families and us all together. So there was that intimacy, and yet we felt like we went inside the Chiso factory, photographed it. You feel, when you say responsible to the subject, it's not like saying you have to portray them in a nice way. The responsibility is you portray them exactly the way you saw it to the best of your ability. So if they're evil or whatever it is you saw, you have to accurately do that. And that's your responsibility to the subject. So our responsibility to Chiso was that, exactly what we saw, we had to convey to the viewer. Yeah.
Maybe could you say a little bit more about your initial involvement in the environmental movement and the activism side, and how you see that kind of relating to your perspective as a photographer, or were they just sort of mutually developed?
Well, I think that we were journalists when we were there. So like I say, it was quite intimate. Living with a family who hasn't been a Honda disease or lost a daughter, and all of that. and I also got to be friends with Shinobu. Here, that's my purse right there. We were just shopping, and she was calling her mom or something. It was that kind of immersion, and yet always we knew we were journalists. The responsibility was to the viewer, also. So I wasn't an activist then. I was not an activist then. The book evolved. We first were just going to do an essay, but then all this was happening, and we ended up saying we have to do a book. But that was what I was doing, and then I phased into kind of activism after that. When we learned, somebody from Canada wrote and said there's a native reservations where people are being polluted with mercury and they're getting an amount of disease. And I went there. And so my initial kind of activism started with sort of connect. I was always interested in connecting people. Like I was interested in connecting two cultures because I grew up in Japan, and then I went to junior high and high school in St. Louis County, and they were just complete two different worlds. They never met an Asian ever. In 8 years, I only met 2 Asians, and it was like 100% Caucasian and just me. And suddenly I was the Oriental, representing Asia or something. So anyway, I was always interested in two cultures getting to know each other. So with the Canadian, I organized, this is after we got our book out, I organized the Native people coming to Japan and going to Minamata in a second outbreak in Niigata, and then victims going to Canada. And so I started doing that kind of victim exchange, getting victims meeting each other. And it's an empowerment, and that's how I kind of phased into activism. So I did another book of, again, Southern Japan. These are people who became Christians and then they went into hiding because of the persecution. And I photographed there, and I think it's the only time that there's somebody that really photographed all their ceremonies and everything. Mm-hmm. But then after that, I didn't really photograph that much.
Yeah, I talked about the Indigenous case as well. I'm actually Japanese Canadian, and in my book, The Stakes of Exposure, I talked about that, and I think it's a really important way that you drew attention to kind of this issue as a transnational issue in a way, something that exceeds national boundaries, and it really, should be looked at. In both cases, it's the most vulnerable people in society that would be exposed to these diseases, those who are poverty-stricken, and in both cases, people being further ostracized for having the disease.
Right.
Which also may explain why someone like Kuwabara was not invited to take photographs at that time, because people were being ostracized, so they didn't want to be further identified with having the disease or to have their whole family connected to it. So
it's even today, if we have a Minamata victim from our family, then, our daughter or a cousin who's 20 years old won't be able to get married. There's a concern, although it's a lot less. There's 3,000 officially designated victims, but over 10 times have applied. But there are like 70,000 people that have some kind of relief, but they're not recognized as Minamata disease. So it's just very complicated, but yes. And in both cases, in Canada and here, in Canada, the reservation employment was like 90%, and then it went down to 10% and 90% welfare because the tourism ended, and the Native people were usually guides out there. So they're suffering economically, and they're getting Minamata disease, mercury poisoning. Same in Minamata, because the fishing was never banned, so the people who fished had to do a self-imposed ban, which means it cuts off your income, and yet they're the ones that have been eating the most fish and had Minamata disease. So,
what is it about photography that is the record of these events? How do you think about photography as being the main medium for you? Was that just because that period occurred, or is it because of the way that there is an authenticity to photography? And do you think that has changed over time? In our age of new media.
Okay, if I don't answer that on time, you ask it, please be asked it. Well, I didn't. Jean always said, it's getting the message out. So it's getting the message out. So it's about, the photograph works, but you shouldn't be like a purist saying, I have to convey this image through photography, and I'm a failure if I cannot do it. So there should be no caption or no explanation. So he's saying that you want to get the message out, so it's text and the image, and it's a combination. And so that was always the way we worked. And it was just, I mean, Gene was such a dedicated photographer that it was, what we were trying to do is through images and text, get the story out. So I wasn't coming from a researcher aspect or an activist, viewpoint. It was more about that final product.
Right.
So it was that we were interested in. And I just want to say that the images, I think it has to be a combination of really iconic, where it's like iconic, where that one photograph just really has impact. And at the same time, Gene felt like it was storytelling. So the layout was really important. Like, that's why he really liked exhibitions, because you could lay it out much more freely.
Rather than one image.
Right. So it's important to not say like, look at how great a photographer I am. Here's this image. Oh, look at another great shot I got. Here it is. It's the story and the impact, the total impact that's important. At the same time, those iconic images are really important. And so if you look at and check the credits and stuff like that, those iconic images are Gene's. They're like Gene's iconic,
like the pipe.
Yeah, like the pipe, or the very beginning of that one fish and in a silhouette, and Tomoko in the bath.
Right.
And Tomoko in the bath was, I was there together, so it was the four of us, the mother and the daughter and Gene and I. But that vision was very much Gene's. Yeah. I did not see that photograph when we went there. Whereas virtually every other photograph, I could kind of see, what I was doing, and I could kind of see what he was doing.
Some people have read that photograph as kind of having like a pieta-like quality to it, which would come from maybe a Christian background. So that might be the reason why you didn't encounter that space and see it in that same light immediately.
Maybe. I think it was because I was 21 to 24. You're interested in, you're just interested in like getting a story out and everything like that. I didn't really, Gene saw kids much better. I think because when you're older, you see something different. Like, when you're older, you see more like a parent-child relationship and in a different way than I was seeing it.
Right.
So I think that was it more than maybe a Christian thing.
Right.
The other thing is, it was told, it looked like, it's like Pieta, but with Pieta, it's the mother grieving for her dead son. But with Tomoko, it's the mother loving the alive child.
Right.
So it's really different.
Right.
But Tomoko died in 76. So right after, just about when she was 21. So right after coming of age, she was 20. And so, the feeling changed afterwards of the Bierats. So it's a long story, but finally I decided not to release the photograph again. So that's been like 24 years.
Right.
And it's been a real struggle. And it's a long story, but to summarize it, it was like they wanted her to rest. And I was struggling with the fact that, after Gene died, the photograph that was the biggest demand was that one, and I kept releasing it, and it was almost like people just say, we want to have that photograph, we want to, and if we get that photograph, we've done our job about telling the world about pollution or something. It was like that constant, I just felt like it's like Tony Boat's going out in the world, kind of working, and it was almost like now's the time for everybody else to work on this problem, and I didn't feel good, and I was trying to figure out how to deal with it. I think that if I was immersed more in the world of photography and more supported, yet there wasn't anybody that really understood. And so when the parents just said, I want her to rest, I decided that it would be a kind of like a travesty to get the world to have the photograph out when the family was saying, please, no, let her rest. I've written about it. It's in the book, or no, it's not in the book, but I've written about it since, and I could maybe send you a copy, or maybe I already did. But yeah, so but some people say I just 호기시다, 저작권 호기시다, which means abandoning your copyright, which is it's exercising your copyright, because the copyright is also to say no in some cases. So in these cases, no. It's not like it's not a statement of what people with photographers should do if the subject comes to you and says something like that. It's what I did. Yeah. And now with the age of the internet, it's like completely topsy-turvy, because people who come and want the copyright, I say no to still, and yet it's legal to have it on Wikipedia in the US. It's out there, so it's now completely reversed. So to take care of that photograph, it's not happening now, because it's reversed. Right? But the parents were still struggling with it, and I'm needing to take time. But I did say yes to the movie. That was quite painful, but I knew that it ended up being a complete replica of the scene made. And so if that image didn't appear in the photograph, in the movie, of Tomoko in the movie, then it's almost like that Hollywood version, which they did, beautifully and all that, but that would become Tomoko and her mother.
Right.
And I knew I would regret that for the rest of my life. So I just got on a plane. I said to Andrew, I'm going to go see you in London. So I bought a ticket and went to London just to see him, and saw the last edit and said okay to use the photograph, and turn around and get back. So yeah, I was there like a day.
Because you felt like her story would not be present.
Their story, would be present. And I went to the parents afterwards and told them.
And how did they receive it?
Well, it's almost like, you break a commitment and then you tell it afterwards instead of saying, this is what I'm going to do. Mm-hmm. But I know that if I say, this is what I'm going to do, I knew it had to be done. And I didn't want to have that burden of them having to say no or yes. So that's the order I did it in. But our relationship was, pretty good. We continued to have discussion. The father died exactly a year ago. So, I know the mother. In fact, they raised their grandson. The boy that was sleeping there, his child was raised by the grandparents. And so we visit now at my grandson. And the teenager really kind of get along. Yeah. So all of this is continuing, but I need to do something about it. This is an example of somebody, Jean was with somebody who was a very talented artist, Carol Thomas, and she drew, but she was an artist, kind of born an artist. I don't think I'm not born an artist, I did this, but it wasn't like, I remember when we got nominated for the National Book Award, the publisher came to me and said, he basically was saying Gene's old, but he was only in his early, his 50s. But, now you've got a great career in photography, and I didn't feel anything. It's not like, I think it's something that happened. There's lots of people like that, right? That wrote this book or something, and it's out there and it's so well known, and that's what they did, and then they went on and did other things. They didn't become an author, afterwards. So I did do one more book, but it was just a natural thing to be involved with the activism. Yeah, but I do take photographs all the time. I have tons of photographs of my grandchild, and I also when I go to Minamata, I end up taking photographs. But it is that feeling of, if I'm going to do it really right, it's got to be total immersion. So I do photograph. I have photographs of the victims at ceremonies and at lawsuits. Yeah.
But I think it is true that you did make those photographs, and you were a photographer, have done a great deal of work. So I think that your humbleness is lovely to witness. But there are other occasions where I feel like your contributions have been overlooked by exhibitions, by writings about Vinamata, and in the film. In my opinion, you should claim your drive.
Not that I'm writing that.
and your talent and your dedication, and that kind of drive and dedication is what makes an artist. And it's kind of beautiful the way you compare yourself to Jean's eye. It's yourself differently, but nonetheless, you are a photographer and have major contributions, and I do hope going forward that more people recognize.
Thank you. Yeah, I that clock is completely different, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I think
we're so good. Yeah. I love photography. I mean, I notice, the moment I have time, I'm editing the on the iPhone, and sending it out to people and stuff like that. And then when I just started Instagram, I put a couple pictures, and one photographer says, "Photographer is back," But I'm not. I do have that eye, and I keep doing it, So, but I'm overextended with this activism that I do now, which is just really challenging lawsuits and negotiations with the government, and everything. So that's what I'm doing. I try to incorporate everything together.
How do you maintain your spirit? I was telling my students that I traveled to Minamata for my research, and at the time my son was a young baby, and the first articles I was reading about were all these very young children who were affected by it. And I still found the place to be rather desolate, and I told them that I just felt so depressed while I was there, and it was very hard. And I wonder how you maintain a positive spirit, dealing with these tragedies, these really deceptions by both corporations and government, and how you maintain a positive spirit.
It's kind of easy. I don't find it difficult. Although, I mean, it's when you're doing decades and you're losing and all that, and all these different all-nighters that continue. But when we were there, that's really, I think, when you're 20s, the kind of thing you experience in your 20s really sinks in, And I think the most important thing I would say is just get inspired. That inspired is the most important, because it just stays with you. And I know that when the victims won the lawsuit, it was only because all sorts of people got involved, meaning the victims, and of course lawyers and the supporters, but artists, different walks of life, writers, documentary filmmakers, playwrights, but also just lots of different, people. Person who ran a big bar and restaurant in Tokyo used the room when they went and sat in, everything. That when a lot of people come together, something really was thought impossible could happen, because they won that lawsuit, and Chiso was found legally responsible and had to pay real compensation. So that kind of inspiration that it's just this thing I feel inside here. I can literally feel it inside here. It's like a fire, a flame that's burning, and it never goes out. And it's not something that I have to keep nurturing. It's just here for me. And it doesn't matter, no matter what discouragement happens, it's just here. So I think that that's the inspiration. And I feel like in Japan, there's a lot of people, the older people go, oh, the young people, we don't know what they're doing. They're so irresponsible, whatever, all that talk. It's not that at all. I think it's that those of us who are older need to basically not lecture, but to show, to show how that these things can happen, to show something can really happen. And that's so, and then finally, the people were so interesting. I think people who rise up and fight, they're like all characters. Everybody, it's like, I think that a lot of times in history, you don't realize the humor and the different characters that are involved. You just see the history written down, like, I don't know, facts and stuff like that. But it's just that they're characters. Everybody's such a character. And yeah, so, and everybody's so different. and it's like using that individuality. It's so, interesting. And also, yeah, trying to make something happen, you have to kind of, use your creativity. And I feel like activism is an art and a technique. It's like an art to home. It's like a shiatsu in judo. Shiatsu where you have to find the right pressure point because the challenge is so big. So where do you find that little thing where you can just, how shiatsu, somebody's going like this and you're like, ah. So it's finding that. And also judo, because the things that are status quo are so powerful, but how do you use that to move things forward? Kind of. So it's like a technique, to home. And then you meet different characters and then doing things together is so much fun. That I really kind of went on and on. But right now, I'm not photographing, but the 9 photographers that the guy that's heading is one of them, but the 9 photographers that photograph Minamata, Gene's sort of in a different category because his archive is in Tucson, Center for Creative Photography. But, it's like Gene's and my joint thing, this Minamata thing. But right now, the daily contact with the 9 photographers, everybody from Kuwabara, 1960, all the way through, and several are still photographing. There were several photographers when we were there. And we've all gotten together, and we're talking. I had a Zoom 2 nights ago at midnight. I hardly wait with them. And we're trying to archive all our material and do things jointly where we can be, kind of remain for future generations. Also getting the word out more to the world now. Maybe doing a joint book or joint exhibitions. We did one in Japan. So it's now working on a lot of archiving and stuff, which isn't exactly my thing. I don't know. So we're all just characters and people who are interested in archiving and documenting these little details, but we have to do it. So I'm in the middle of doing all that. Yeah.
Do we have any questions?
Yeah,
I have a couple minutes
lots
left.
of questions that I have to
Ask.
I gotta talk faster.
How much do activism and photography go hand in hand? Is one a prerequisite to the other?
I think that there's different kinds of photography. So some photography would be completely, activism. You're doing activism, and photography is a medium to do that activism. Where it's completely about activism. And advocating something. Or and then there's photography. There's just different kinds of photography, right? There's photography that's very personal, that you're trying to photograph the beauty of things or whatever, or even with photojournalism, where you're not trying to create a specific change. So I think it depends, but I think that it can be in conjunction with activism, photography and activism. And also I think it can be maybe a term that's not activism, but, describing or expression, which might not, that person doing that expression might not see it as, as activism, right? So I think it could be lots of things. Photography could be lots of things.